Good afternoon. My name is Robert Pine. I'm Program Director for the Mothi Center. I'd like to welcome you to this program, the second in our series of webinars to discuss refugee resettlement in America, and here in Brown County, Wisconsin in particular. This program is co-sponsored by Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Green Bay, Wisconsin Literacy, and the Mothi Center. The Mothi Center is an independent nonprofit on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, dedicated to the promotion of peace, justice, and mutual respect, supporting individual and community flourishing while welcoming all cultures and faiths. The center's educational programs create space for curiosity, reflection, and respectful conversation, addressing vital concerns as we seek to move forward together. Wisconsin Literacy is a nonprofit statewide coalition of literacy agencies. They strengthen literacy statewide through expert training, personalized consultations, health literacy, workforce connections, and advocacy. Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Green Bay is an affiliate agency of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, one of the few national organizations authorized by the U.S. State Department to resettle refugees. Catholic Charities is the only agency managing initial resettlement and placement for newly arrived refugees during their first 3 months in Brown County. And they collaborate with many other offices and nonprofits to provide extended support beyond that crucial 3-month period. Before introducing our guests this afternoon, I'd like to note that we will have time at the end to address some of your questions, which can be submitted at any time using the Q&A or chat features at the bottom of your screen. Today's guest is my friend Jill Drzewiecki, joining us from Rome. Jill is the Gender Responsive Education Specialist with Jesuit Refugee Service, working in their international office. She's from Wisconsin and is a notable graduate of St. Norbert College, which recognized her a couple of years ago with their Ambassador of Peace Award. Jesuit Refugee Service is a humanitarian organization that's active in 57 countries around the world. It serves over 1 million forcibly displaced people and members of host communities, primarily in the areas of education, livelihoods, reconciliation, and psychosocial support. There are approximately 120 million people forcibly displaced around the world today, and almost 50 million of those have fled their countries as refugees. To imagine that number, think of the entire west coast of the US, the combined populations of California, Oregon, and Washington, forced to flee for their lives, simply looking for a place of refuge. We've asked Jill Drzewiecki to help us understand more about what they experience along the way. Jill, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's good to be back home, albeit virtually. Thank you for the introduction. And we're going to just move right into clarifying what the objectives for this evening are, well, afternoon there in Wisconsin. So Robert reached out to me to ask if I could contribute to this series that's aiming to provide an overview of and nurture a deeper understanding of refugee resettlement as a durable solution for refugees in the US, Wisconsin, and especially Brown County. Slide, please. So for tonight, I think the objective that I have is to zoom out a little bit and to provide some perspective of the global refugee reality, and where our time is quite limited, but I'm hoping to provide a space for reflecting on and understanding the refugee experience before being resettled in the United States, Wisconsin, and Brown County. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to be sharing some images, and most of the images this evening will focus on the current situation in Sudan and the flight of people trying to find safety from the ongoing crisis in Sudan. And also I do want to acknowledge that many of the photos that I will share as well and experiences will be focused in sub-Saharan Africa. So JRS, Jesuit Refugee Service, works in about 57 countries, but most of my work is focused on sub-Saharan Africa. So I just want to acknowledge that bias of the presentation of my own experience. And I also wanted to say that we have a very short time together to cover a very complex and increasingly complicated refugee reality. I also wanted to note that I feel a bit not qualified to speak on behalf of refugees. So in one way, I feel like I'm not the appropriate person to share the experiences of 120 million forcibly displaced people across the globe. At the same time, I hail from Wisconsin and have had the privilege of working with forcibly displaced people from across the globe. So I just wanted to share a little anecdote about my first mission with JRS to our Southern Africa region. It was in 2017, and I was in urban areas in South Africa and then also in a refugee camp in Malawi. I came back from that trip and I had to write a short report before leaving back to Wisconsin to go home for a family vacation. When I came back to Rome after the family vacation, I felt awful. I felt like death and ended up in the emergency room in the middle of the night. They tested me for the next 24 hours or something. I saw there was a message in the chat. So anyways, I was in the emergency room. They tested me for various tropical diseases and sent me home, said I must just be dehydrated. Another week or two passed, and I still wasn't feeling well, and I started to have some complications trying to walk or like even turn the key in the gate at my home. And I was sent to another specialized doctor in infectious diseases, and I was finally diagnosed with Lyme disease. So I share that anecdote because I believe that having Lyme's disease uniquely qualifies me as a Wisconsinite, and I hope that that gives me some street cred with the audience this evening to share my experiences. However, I did want to make sure that we're amplifying the voices of refugees throughout this presentation. On the screen now we see a figure. Every 20th of June, the UN Refugee Agency, or UNHCR, publishes a Global Trends in Forced Displacement report. There are now 120 million people worldwide who are forcibly displaced. And this is the 12th year in a row that the number of forcibly displaced people has increased. So among those people, there are different kinds of forced displacement. And we'll get into that in a moment. It was also covered in the previous webinar. But to break that down for you a little bit, as Robert did in the introduction, that's like largely the West Coast of the United States. It also means that 1 in 69 people on the planet these days have been forced to flee their home. So they're either displaced to other parts of their own country or across an international border, which would make them a refugee. So this is a big change. Just a decade ago, just 1 in 125 people were displaced. And the global population of forcibly displaced people has doubled in the last decade. So that's a bit of an overwhelming, a daunting figure, and the enormity of the crisis can sometimes be paralyzing. I hope today to give you some perspective about the challenges that we face, but also around solutions. Slide, please. I want to leave you for a moment to read this quote from Filippo Grande, who is the big boss or the UN High Commissioner to Refugees, juxtaposed with this image of a woman fleeing violence in Sudan, cooking in what is a transit center in Renk, South Sudan, where she's fled. And as I look at this image, I think, what is she cooking? Who is she cooking for? As a woman, I can't help but wonder, does she have her period? If so, how is she managing it with dignity under these conditions? And of course, my job at the end of the day is to ask, how do we protect people like her and uphold their dignity in conditions like these? Slide, please. Okay, it looks like we're going to have a little bit of a technical difficulty here, but I wanted to do an interactive thing with you, and it's okay. I'm just going to ask Jill to the other Jill, to open up the chat for a moment. And since the objective of this webinar is to create a space for reflecting on and understanding the refugee experience, at least a little bit. And since the refugee experience, again, while it's diverse, is largely about leaving one's home and trying to find and rebuild a new one or a durable solution. I wanted to give folks a few minutes to enter a few phrases or words into what was going to be a word cloud. But maybe you could just drop a few words or phrases into the chat. We'll try and make that work. If it doesn't, that's okay. We're agile. But I would like you just maybe personally to reflect on some words or phrases or images that make you think about home. We'll give you a moment for that. Thank you. I'll read out some of what we see in the chat. Comfort, familiarity, bed, yes, preferably a comfortable one, right? Safe, well-known, stability, dignity, relaxed. That's very important because many of refugees' experiences, daily experiences, are about daily stressors. Thank you. We invite a few more. Cats. A shower. Yes. Thank you so much for participating. Now, I think we might have another technical challenge. So the next slide is, I wanted to be able to share some poetry. And instead, we're going to drop the link in the chat, I believe, for a poem by Warsan Shah, who's an award-winning British poet. She was born to Somali refugee parents in Kenya. And her words in this poem, which you'll hear shortly once you click on the link, have been called a rallying call for refugees and their advocates. If you are uncomfortable with dehumanizing language and graphic descriptions of violence, including sexual violence, then you may want to consider not watching the video or listening to the poem. And when the video concludes, well, we'll move on to the next slide. So once we get to the next slide, then you can turn your audio back on. Actually, it's not going to matter. I would just say then don't listen to the poem. For those of you who would like to access the link, it's in the chat, and we'll take a moment to listen to a refugee voice through poetry. Okay, we'll continue. If you didn't have a chance to click on the link or figure out how to be watching the webinar and listen to the poem at the same time, I hope you'll take a moment to step back. I'm very interested in always learning from the voices. And there's a lot of beautiful poetry, literature, film, music, and voices in exile. So I hope to, through the presentation this evening, share some of those with you. But just to take a step back, so let's think about before folks are resettled in Wisconsin, or Brown County more specifically, where are they, right? So when people flee their homes, 69% of them are hosted in neighboring countries. This is at the end of 2023. And of those 69%, 75% are being hosted in low to middle income countries. 20% are being hosted by the least developed countries. And finally, 66% are in protracted situations. Protracted situations means, technically, I'll read the definition for you. A protracted situation is one in which 25,000 or more refugees from the same nationality have been in exile for 5 or more years in a given country of asylum. Slide, please. So the reason I share those statistics is because globally there is a significant imbalance in the distribution of refugees, with a very small number of countries who are shouldering much of the responsibility for hosting refugees. And oftentimes those are the same countries that are struggling to provide services, whether it's education or health services or good roads, to their own populations. So we can imagine that that's quite a challenging and complex situation to work in. I would note that in JRS's work and in the humanitarian space at large, we do not just provide services to refugee communities. The best practices in the field are that you serve and you work with the host community as well. That's a way to lift up and create systems change so that these poorer countries can then be able to better meet the needs of refugees and their host communities. It reduces tension between these two populations. Also, with over 100 active conflicts going on in the world right now, the duty of care to protect refugees and to provide them with new homes and to help them rebuild their lives is falling largely to these countries with the least resources. So given the sometimes changing political climate and the rhetoric in the United States, I just think that this is probably one of the most important takeaways that I would like to share this evening, is that most refugees are being hosted in low to middle income countries. Slide, please. And of those refugees, of the 120 million refugees, only 1%, actually less than 1% of them will ever be resettled. Resettlement options in the US and globally, are largely dependent on political policy cycles and public opinion. They shift. The numbers for resettlement are not determined by the determined by the resettlement countries and not by the UN Refugee Agency. So again, if only 1% of refugees are ever being resettled, and some of those 1% to the United States, and even a smaller percent to Brown County, where are those refugees living out their lives and trying to make homes? Slide, please. So I think that the very mention of refugees often, at least in my childhood, I remember the crisis, the famine in Ethiopia, and it conjures up images of rows and rows of tents and shelters and camps where inhabitants are largely reliant on humanitarian aid for surviving, not thriving. But what I want to point out, first of all, is that of the 120 million forcibly displaced people, again, many of those are forced to flee within their own country, so they never crossed an international border. So of the 120 million people who are forcibly displaced, about 43 million are refugees. And of those refugees, the journey is not always very linear. Many will find themselves in reception and transit centers. And some of those images throughout the presentation this evening are taken in transit or in reception centers along the way. Tonight, we're largely going to focus on the refugee camp experience and talk about some of the conditions, challenges, opportunities of the refugee camp model, as well as reasons why it's not sufficient given the current crisis. Refugees also find themselves, depending on the legal framework of their country, in detention centers. When people can't find durable solutions, they are often in transit, moving to another place. Increasingly, and this is hopeful in my line of work, people are living in integrated settlements, meaning that they're not confined to a refugee camp where they can't work or have freedom of mobility. And then also, many of the world's refugees today live in urban areas. So again, I think that this is another takeaway about refugees before they might be resettled, is that more than half of the world's refugees are living in cities and urban areas. So a lot of Syrians, for example, or Venezuelans who've been fleeing the last years are living in urban areas where they're often struggling to make ends meet. There are challenges about living in urban areas as well, and that's because everyone's not in one place, so coordinating services can be more difficult. And so if most people are not going to be resettled, and most people will not be able to return home safely and voluntarily, we realize that durable solutions, or solutions that allow people to no longer be forcibly displaced, that allow people to no longer be refugees. In short, they are not keeping pace with the growth of forced displacement. And so sadly, forced displacement is a growth industry as of today and as of the last decade, and it's one of the great challenges of our lifetimes. Slide, please. So again, I'm going to ask Jill to open, before that, I just wanted to use these solutions to give us to glimpse what's happening to folks. Again, about 160,000 people in 2023 were resettled. So you see that's a very small percent of refugees globally. And so as we continue to have more people forcibly displaced, the solutions just cannot keep up with the needs. And of course, there's a group of stateless people as well. Many of those actually are born into refugee camps. And so again, a solution for them is to be naturalized and to be able to become citizens where they are. And again, through my experience, most people would love to return home, but conflicts are ongoing increasingly. Slide, please. So another question for you, and if Jill could open up the chat again, just for a moment, I wanted to ask people, how long do you think refugees are displaced on average before achieving a durable solution? So let's take a moment, we'll open up the chat and you can share your thoughts about that. Lifetimes, yes. I saw 7 years, I saw lifetimes, 15 years. Thank you. So on average, it's taking people about 20 years to find new homes or to reach a durable solution. Again, those solutions traditionally are being able to return voluntarily and safely to your home country or community. to be resettled in a third country like the United States, or to locally integrate. And so increasingly local integration or inclusion into national systems is the best option on the table. There are some other durable solutions. Complementary pathways is something that, if you're interested, you can take a look at, but it's not one of the traditional solutions. Next slide, please. So before, so the nature, as we can see, of forced displacement and the traditional refugee camp model are increasingly incompatible with today's needs, or at least incompatible with trying to find homes, long-term homes, or what we call durable solutions. Forced displacement is no longer short-term. Protracted conflicts render camps problematic. And so the refugee camp model is no longer congruent with finding long-term durable solutions, or at least providing places where people can live with dignity. Refugee camps are not able, increasingly, to provide adequate humanitarian response that protects people and upholds their dignity. And we're going to talk about some of the conditions of refugee camps, some of the barriers and challenges in a moment. But before we do that, I just wanted to share, what are some of the opportunities of displacement? Slide, please. That may sound like a really strange thing to say, but I just want to make sure that the tenor and the tone of this conversation really conveys how diverse people who are forced to flee are, the potential that they have, the innovation that I experience when I meet with them and work with them and accompany them, and their resilience. So to a large extent, they have the agency to find their own solutions, and they have the agency also and the will and the desire to give back once they are given a chance. This image here kind of shows the entrepreneurial spirit in a transit center. Already you can see that business is booming in this pop-up in a transit center. So for me, it's very important that we also think about that refugees have agency, that they want self-reliance. And so what, as humanitarian workers and people who are committed to durable solutions, how do we need to approach that? Slide, please. To that end, last December, I was fortunate to attend the Global Refugee Forum. This is an event that happens every 4 years. And during the event, I attended the Nansen Awards. The Nansen Awards, named after a kind of a passport that was given to people that allowed them freedom of movement, even when they were refugees. The awards now honor individuals and organizations who go above and beyond the call of duty to protect refugees, IDPs, internally displaced people, and stateless people. So at these awards, they give regional awards, and they also honor one global laureate. And I wanted to share this image and this experience with Abdullahi Maher. He's a former refugee from Somalia. He grew up in Dadaab refugee camp, which is a very large refugee camp in Kenya. Again, like a classic example of a protracted situation. And he was very much supported by his mother and understood that education was his ticket out of the camp. And he completed high school. He graduated from college with a degree in journalism and public relations. But instead of pursuing a lucrative career, he returned to Dadaab to help other refugees realize their own potential. Specifically, he set up libraries in the camp where girls and boys could be in protected spaces to study. And he collected over 100,000 books for children in Dadaab. And I remember what he said about refugees like himself at the awards, and I wanted to share that with you. He said, remove the barriers, and we will do the rest. Refugees will do the rest. So increasingly, what I see is that systems and structures that are in place to address forced displacement, create barriers actually for people who have incredible human capital, incredible human potential. They're motivated to transform their own realities. So it's largely, I believe, my responsibility and the work of people who care about upholding dignity to support refugees by removing barriers, and not just economic barriers, political barriers, but barriers in our hearts and our minds. So thank you for letting me share that story. Next slide, please. And being consistent with the last presentation, I just wanted to share a book recommendation. This is if I had to recommend one book to folks out there, this is a great one. It's a graphic novel about growing up in Dadaab refugee camp. And it's told by a Somali refugee, When Stars Are Scattered. So that's my shameless plug. And then we'll move on to the next slide. So what are the challenges of camps and the camp model? So it's very expensive, it's not sustainable, and for the current situation of 120 million people being displaced. And it creates, and this will be one of the complaints and the criticisms that you'll hear about humanitarian aid directed at refugees as well, is that it creates reliance on service delivery, but people are not allowed to work generally in the formal economy when they're in a camp model. So it's a sticky wicket. Finally, as the amount of forced displacement goes up and resources go down, there's just not enough funding to address the growing needs. And typically that funding shifts where there's the most attention. So the newest crisis will typically get the most funding, and the steady flow for ongoing services such as food or education will decrease. Finally, most of the camp settings that I work with were built years and years ago, decades ago. They're overcrowded and they're basically modern day slums. And so this impacts on people's daily life. At the beginning of the presentation, someone mentioned like home is a place where you can relax. It's very difficult to imagine like relaxing, and there's a lot of queues. You're always queuing for things. It also impacts on longer term pathways to self-reliance, which fundamentally is the goal, right? Self-reliance and a durable solution. And finally, complicating the situation now is that many camps are located in places that are highly vulnerable to climate change. So we talk about climate change as a threat multiplier. And again, migration will continue to be an adaptation strategy, or a way that people deal with climate change, is that they're going to continue to move. Next slide. So we'll dig in a little bit more to some of these challenges. So first of all, we are seeing that refugee camps are as large as cities. And again, they lack sustainable livelihood opportunities for people. This is an image of Zatari refugee camp in Jordan. And it's become, unfortunately, the symbol of a long-running Syrian crisis, of the long-running Syrian refugee crisis and war. This picture here is taken on the 10th anniversary of the camp in 2022, to be specific. And at that time, only 4% of refugees living in the camp were allowed to have work permits. So you can imagine that the conditions that creates, not ideal. It leads to consequences, unhealthy coping strategies. Residents of Zatari complained of going into debt. People have strategies to deal with not being able to work in the formal economy. Girls and women especially end up being pushed into survival activities. Next slide, please. And now a film recommendation, because we're about to move to another camp, Kakuma Refugee Camp, to explore some of these barriers and challenges of the camp model. But if you haven't seen it, there's a great film, a bit dated, I think it's 2014, but it's specifically about being resettled in the United States, in Kansas specifically. So if you haven't seen it, it's the orphaned children from the Civil War in Sudan end up fleeing, the Lost Boys specifically. So the Lost Boys ended up fleeing largely to Kakuma Refugee Camp, which is in the northwest corner of Kenya, and it's an arid region. It was first established in 1992. And again, it was established to host, I think around, don't quote me on this, I'm not even going to say, but today it's registering about 200,000 asylum seekers and refugees. It's huge. It's a city in the middle of the desert. The reason I'm going to share some experiences from this today is because over the past year, I've been working a lot in Kenya because in last year, January 2023, JRS became the implementing partner, or that means that we became responsible for managing the secondary schools in the camp. And Kakuma epitomizes a typical protracted refugee situation. It's a place where financing for addressing needs continues to dwindle, and the needs continue to escalate. More asylum seekers arrive every day, and services generally just cannot keep up with the high needs. Slide, please. So, as I mentioned, people are not, even though Kenya is working on inclusion and something that's called the Sharika Plan, we're not there yet. There's chronic hunger and stress in the camp. So over the years, the World Food Program, again, that's the agency that's responsible for food rations. And again, as people are not allowed to work, they're dependent upon those food rations. But over the years, as more conflicts have been ignited across the globe, those food rations have decreased from first 60 to 50%. And just this last May, I was going to say last month, but this last month, World Food Program further reduced the food rations from 50 to 40% of the previous amounts. The day after that happened, we were told the story of a mother in the neighboring Kalo Bay refugee settlement. Eventually, Kakuma expanded so much that there was no more room for people, and so they opened up a settlement next to it. And a mother died by suicide because she didn't know how she was going to feed her children on the decreased rations. So this is and we see rates of suicide increasing, unfortunately, in the camp, especially as poverty, hunger, and stress continue to become chronic, I would say. So in addition to daily needs such as eating, next slide, please. People are dealing with a lack of access to education services, health services, and mental health services. Here is a QR code to a report that I worked on over this last year. It's about barriers to accessing and completing secondary education. And I'm going to speak a bit about education because it's my area of expertise. And I think it's a good way to kind of convey the challenges and the lack of systems that are able to support refugees in the refugee camp model. So slide, please. So only about 16% of all of the youth in Kakuma refugee camp are accessing secondary education. When I say secondary education, it's the equivalent of high school in the United States, right? So over the last decades, there's been a big push, which is a good thing, towards universal primary education, but then that has left this backlog and this gap for secondary education. And just to see how that plays out in a place like Kakuma refugee camp, there are 21 primary schools, and then that diminishes to 7 secondary schools. So first, most youth are not even able to access secondary education. And then again, as you saw, or as was introduced, I'm specifically working on increasing girls' access to secondary education and completion. And so you can see how that breaks down when it's disaggregated by gender as well. So fewer girls have access to secondary education, and there's all kinds of reasons for that, which we'll talk about as we move forward. Slide, please. So when you're in a situation where there's chronic hunger, chronic stress, chronic poverty, unfortunately, we see very high rates of gender-based violence. We know that conflict and displacement heighten the risk. Just very practically speaking, that when families don't have enough resources to send their children to school, they will often prioritize a boy's education over a girl's education. Girls may have to stay home to care for other siblings or older members of the family as their parents go out to work. Many are tasked with fetching firewood or fetching water, and that is increasingly challenging in these contexts as well. And that's linked to the climate change challenge. And again, the threat multiplier, I would say that girls are having to go further and further to fetch firewood or to fetch water. And then this puts them at greater risk of gender-based violence. Slide, please. I wanted to share some images of some of how we're experiencing climate change firsthand in JRS. This was a flood in Maban a couple of years ago. So in the QR code that you saw a few slides ago, when we go to do a gender responsive education analysis, we look for what are the barriers on the supply side, the demand side, and the enabling environment side. I won't get into that tonight. That's not the focus of our discussion. But what I will say is the enabling environment has to do with what are the circumstances around the school environment that impact on people being able to access education. So sometimes for boys, it might be forced recruitment into armed forces. And very interestingly, this was the first time it's come out in an assessment. It was the unpredictable and extreme weather conditions that are the biggest barrier, enabling environment barrier in Kakuma to accessing school. So we know in these contexts where refugees are being hosted that weather events are more frequent and severe. We know that climate change heightens the needs and the risks of people who are already forcibly displaced. And if we don't focus on adaptation measures, then climate change will continue to disproportionately impact affected communities and will be those who are vulnerable, and it will continue to contribute to ongoing onward movements or increased migration. Slide, please. So specifically as it relates to education in Kakuma refugee camp, here you can see there's a big lager, which is a riverbed that's usually dry, like extremely dry. But then there'll be these torrential rains and it floods, and there's no paved roads. And this, I think, was an attempt at a bridge some years ago. But this is how you have to get to the schools. You have to cross this otherwise dry lager. So one of the challenges with the extreme and unpredictable weather is just the challenge of commuting to and from school. There's pressure on the already limited secondary school infrastructure. I mentioned there's only 7 secondary schools, and there's issues with resources and the burden of the chores falling disproportionately to girls. And then, of course, the ongoing poverty, it aggravates and perpetuates conditions for forced marriage. So largely, there are some traditional practices that girls are sold and a dowry is paid or a bride price is paid, and people will have to depend on that for resources instead of working in the more formal economy. Slide, please. I'll give you a moment to read this quote. So of course, the schools are pretty basic structures that have a tin roof on them, and they're extremely hot and extremely overcrowded. In Kakuma specifically, and you'll see this in a lot of refugee contexts because there's just not enough space, there'll be a double shifting of classes. So one group of students will go in the morning and one group will go in the afternoon. And specifically in Kakuma, the group that goes in the afternoon, it's already so sweltering hot, and even the quality of education decreases because the teachers teach both shifts, and it just becomes really excruciatingly hot. And one of the things that JRS is doing is that we're increasing the infrastructure so that there's not as many students in the classroom, and then we're able to get rid of the double shifting in Kakuma. Next slide, please. And here you can see the logger and why it could be difficult to transition or go to school or home from school when this river floods. Next slide, please. So we're wrapping up here in a few minutes. So I won't go into too much detail here, only to say that the current reality forces us to think about some new approaches and new solutions. And thank you, Jill, for dropping that in the chat. So again, moving away from a camp model towards inclusion. I mentioned the Global Refugee Forum before, and there are lots of pledges about working towards getting rid of camps, or at least increasingly allowing refugees to integrate into the local economy, into the local schools, into the wider life of the countries where they're finding themselves. And if we don't do that, again, if the countries where refugees and asylum seekers do not find sufficient protection or access to their rights, then or access to national services and labor markets, then they will continue to choose onward movements, and we're seeing that. And so increasingly, we're seeing a movement towards what's called a root-based approach, not addressing root causes. That's also a big part of our work, but a roots-based approach means being able to understand the route that refugees and migrants travel, and how can we provide services along those routes, protection services, other provision of meeting other needs along those routes. So again, if that's something that you're interested in learning about, that is another way that the field is shifting. Finally, there's such a big emphasis on climate resilience, and how do we provide services like food, water, education? How do we adapt education systems, healthcare systems, and create livelihoods that are relevant to the current climate reality? And of course, finally, one of the biggest things is that we just need to be working towards on local, global levels, wider peace and stability. Next slide, please. Here are some key takeaways that I hope that have been conveyed through today's presentation. I'll hand over to Robert in a moment to maybe walk through these takeaways, but I just would like to say that I hope that I have convinced you not only to be an advocate, but a forceful advocate for increased refugee resettlement in the United States, Wisconsin, and Brown County. I always think of Wisconsin as being a very welcoming place. So thank you for making it a welcoming place for those who are forced to flee.
Thanks so much, Jill. Really appreciate you walking us through those. And as you talk about that, maybe 1% in a camp, or those who are in cities who have an opportunity to be resettled, what's the basis for selection? How does somebody make it into that less than 1%?
Well, I am actually not an expert on resettlement, so I will share a thought or two, but then I would also just invite you to call on someone else who works specifically in the refugee resettlement space. So a lot of the times it's based on, at least in my experience and the people I've met who've qualified for refugee resettlement it's based on some sort of vulnerability criteria. One, so they may be an unaccompanied minor, and they go through a very serious vetting process that will take maybe 2 years. And then increasingly, we're seeing that student or refugees who are able to demonstrate specific qualifications or have access to higher education, we often, JRS, again, the Jesuit tradition has a strong tradition of education. JRS is consistent with that. We really work on access to secondary education and even tertiary or higher education. Once people have those qualifications, unfortunately, in the host countries, oftentimes they're not able to use those higher education degrees, but that does help them become a better and stronger candidate in some cases for resettlement. Of course, then they're plucked from the communities where their skills could be used the most, but it's a good opportunity for many of those refugees who've continued with their education. It incentivizes staying in education. But I don't want to say too much because I don't pretend to be a refugee resettlement expert.
And we will have opportunity on July 9th in our next webinar to speak with some people who have been resettled and to hear a little bit about their journey. And clearly many of them still have families in Dadaab and Zatari and some of these other places where a few have been able to make it out, but not everybody. And it sounds like what you're describing is a really unwieldy and difficult and confusing tension that those who are particularly vulnerable might have access to resettlement, and those who are particularly accomplished might have access. There's a big gap between those. And then likewise, the tension between the resilience of refugees, which we see again and again and again, remove the obstacles and we'll take care of the rest. And yet people who live in these situations that you describe are almost certainly experiencing trauma, are coming with a lot of difficulties behind them that will affect still their pathways forward. So these tensions between self-sufficiency and accomplishment and also the assistance that's needed, it makes the resettlement process really difficult when they do make it here to Wisconsin. So there is going to be Susie Brecky comments, our friend from World Relief, that family reunification is another factor for sure. We'll have an opportunity to talk about that more next time. There's a debate tomorrow night, or no, tonight, and maybe some of you have heard about that. And I'm not going to ask you, Jill, to make any specific comments about candidates. I wouldn't do that to you. But I will say that in the last decade, we've seen some pretty significant shifts in both public opinion and state policy with regard to refugee movement and resettlement in Europe and the US. You're in Italy, you've seen this firsthand there. You're also working with agencies that depend on public and government support. So how has the work of JRS, and for that matter, the whole system administered by UNHCR, been affected by changes in the political climate in Europe and the US?
Yes. Well, thank you for your question, and thank you for not putting me on the spot. And I also want to thank Susie Brecky. I know she does a lot of work, tireless work on refugee resettlement. So you have a lot of great resources there in your community. And thank you for bringing up family reunification, a very important point. Well, increasingly, I would say that nation states are taking notes from one another, and there's a very strong deterrence agenda. It's about, it's not about how can we work together towards solutions. It's how can we get rid of these people as fast as possible, and maybe not seeing some of the opportunities. Whether you approach this from a moral perspective, or you want to look at the economic reasons why welcoming new and diverse members in your community can be an opportunity. So overall, it's a challenging environment to work in. We see that legal framework that has upheld the rights of refugees for many years. It's a challenging time to uphold those frameworks. And a lot of times in the United States specifically, as we look at the quotas that have gone up and down, it's not really a needs-based approach to resettlement. And I think that one of the things that, regardless of political persuasion, I think that we would love to see resettlement needs to be part of unlocking solutions, right? And so we would love to see a further development and expansion of private refugee sponsorship programs to increase the sponsorship capacity in the United States. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does, because as you think about the three durable solutions of return, which often is impossible because of the practice or the principle of non-refoulement. We don't put people back in a situation where they're going to be in jeopardy. So return is a durable solution if it's possible. Resettlement to a third country is another durable solution, which you're suggesting we need to do more. And that's something that we're talking about throughout this whole series, but our numbers are low compared to the need, for sure, as you demonstrated. And then the third durable solution about integration into the communities where they are. It seems that the camp solution, which is not one of the three durable solutions, but seems to endure. The camps that you described, Kakuma and Dadaab and Zatari, they're made of concrete and steel. I've been to Zatari. I've seen the concrete manufacturing plant right outside. I've seen the steel fabrication plant. I've seen them putting up permanent buildings and roads, and asked the camp director if this is going to be a new city. And he said, I certainly hope not, but that was 10 years ago. And it's bigger now and more settled than it was. So those protracted solutions are the ones that seem to endure. And again, if I could just ask you to restate and summarize, why is that not good enough? Because that's what most people, I think, are hoping can just take care of it. It's not going to take care of it, is it?
No. Well, again, I think that the camp model was meant to be a temporary solution. So I'm just going to repeat that situations are protracted and that people cannot become self-reliant when they're not allowed to be included into national education systems or national economic situations. They're dependent on aid, and we don't have the international backing, financing structures, or even coordination mechanisms to be able to uphold people's dignity and provide the kind of protections that's needed into those spaces. Now, of course, logistically, dismantling the camp model is not going to happen overnight. But there are pledges on the table. There are great models. There's the Melka Dida integrated settlement in Ethiopia. Kenya, as I mentioned, is working towards the Sharika plan. So if people are interested in learning more about more of this inclusion mechanisms and moving more toward integrated settlement model, there are resources out there that we can direct folks to. I don't think refugee camps are ever going to go away completely, but hopefully they will be more of a temporary solution than a warehousing of people for entire lifetimes.
Right. That's a good word. You've also talked a little bit about the way that some of the agencies now are helping people along the way, are helping them on their journey and not just waiting for them at some destination. What does that look like?
Yeah, it requires a lot more sophistication of coordination between different agencies. It requires different stakeholders working together and not saying like, okay, we're going to compete, but working in coalition, not competing for the limited financing that's out there, but saying, okay, we're an expert on MHPSS or mental health and psychosocial support. And we're very good at the logistics of moving food. We're very good at shelter, and people working together, being able to map, collect data, and see where the needs are and respond to those needs. And there's
a lot of cooperation.
Yes, I was just 2 weeks ago, I was at the NGO consultations with UNHCR, with the UN Refugee Agency. Oh, there's one more thing that's very important to that model and to the approaches. But there's a lot of goodwill in the room about working together, coordinating better. And one of the things that's really important too is what we call the localization agenda. So again, in this spirit of remove the barriers and give refugees agency. So really moving towards refugee-led organizations, initiatives, and even women-led organizations. So I would say at these consultations that I was recently at, maybe about a third of the stakeholders in the room we're from refugee-led or women-led organization. And so sometimes it's, getting these unusual suspects working together. So when we, for example, JRS, when we provide education services, to a large extent, we're already including refugees in the national system. The governments in these countries are not saying, for the most part, in some places, for example, in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, initially they weren't allowed to learn the local language or use the local curriculum. In most of the places that we work, they are following the national curriculum. What we're doing is we're trying to provide support and build the systems, strengthen the local systems, education systems in this case, so that they can be better to serve refugees and for their host communities. Yeah. So that's not that there's necessarily pushback, it's just that sometimes, again, these are some of the least developed countries in the world, and they don't have the resources. So this is where we come in, we provide that support. We're not creating a parallel system because, again, if people are supposed to integrate into the local context, they need to have high school diplomas that are recognized locally, right?
So again, just to underscore the point about isolation versus cooperation, what you're describing is an incredibly complex situation and system in which countries, agencies need to cooperate with one another, need to communicate and work together to build something integrated. Mm-hmm. And too often we're seeing with the political winds, people wanting to isolate and pull back from such systems, and that just exacerbates the troubles. Mm-hmm. So, Jill, thanks for being with us. We are at time, and I need to probably wrap up, but I just want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for being with us now to describe, again, just some snapshots on the refugee journey. Our next webinar in this series will take place on July 9th, also at noon Central Time. We're going to be joined by representatives of Catholic Charities and Wisconsin Literacy, along with some refugees who have recently arrived in our area to discuss the mechanisms of refugee resettlement and some of the obstacles experienced right here in Brown County. So you can register at the Mothi Center website as you did this time. I know there were a couple of glitches. We're going to try to fix that, but anyway, thanks so much for joining us. Hope to see you all again on July 9th. And Jill, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.